Fantastic. I'll introduce you, Jamie. Yes. Jamie's an advocate for sentientism. He hosts the Sentientism podcast, which has featured guests like the primatologist and author Franz de Waal and human rights activist Peter Tatchell. His writing has been published by Aereo Magazine, Free Inquiry, Sentient Magazine, and on Medium. And he worked as a management consultant for 23 years before leaving to pursue a range of projects like campaigning for sentientism, effective altruism, and more. So looking forward to the presentation.
That's great. Thank you for the kind introduction, Adam, and thank you very much for letting me speak to you today. It's an honor. You're not supposed to start with an apology, but I'm going to, because my throat and my brain might be a little bit fuzzy. Unfortunately, after 2 years of dodging it, I've finally come down with COVID, but it's pretty mild, but I will use that as an excuse for any brain fog I get during the presentation or the questions. So I'm planning to talk for about half an hour, so shut me down if I ramble on too long, so we can spend most of the time on a conversation at the back end. But the topic is, as Adam's already framed it, sentientism, which I describe or summarize, as you can see on this opening page, as evidence, reason, and compassion. Critically for all sentient beings. But it might be useful to explain what sentientism is, and I describe it really as a worldview, a way of looking at the world and understanding it. And the reason I think worldviews are important is because whether we know it or not, every human being has a worldview. We have a way of thinking about the world around us. Some like to make them quite explicit, others it's a more implicit thing. But it strikes me that when we look around the world today, that all of the human-caused problems we see are either at their root, either because of some sort of failure of compassion. You know, we've failed to care or failed to extend our moral consideration in some direction, maybe to other humans, maybe to animals, maybe to the environment. So we've just decided we don't care for some reason. Or it's a failure of belief in some sense. We've just got things wrong about the world around us. We might believe in things that are fabricated, or we've just made a mistake, or we've misunderstood evidence. And I'd be interested if people can think of counterexamples, but as I've worked through many human-caused problems, they all seem to come down to those two problems, a failure of compassion or a failure of epistemology, if you like. How do we know the world? And because us humans, whether we like it or not, have enormous power for good and ill across the world, it seems to me really important, the worldviews that us humans hold, because we have so much power. And to me, the most important things for a worldview to get right are to answer the deepest philosophical questions. One is, I guess, what's real and how should we know things accurately about the world? The other is, who gets to care, right? Who matters and who matters morally? So again, in philosophical terms, that's epistemology, you know, how do we know things? And ethics, you know, what do we care about and who gets to matter? And that's really the framing for this idea of sentientism. It's supposed to be a very, very basic, very broad, very simple worldview that answers those two questions. How should we go about knowing, and who and what should matter? So to run you through that evidence, reason, and compassion structure, the first 2 points, evidence and reason, are answering that first question: how should we go about knowing, and what should we know? And it suggests that we should use a combination of evidence. This can be all sorts of different evidence from our own personal experiences, our own senses, from science, from listening to each other, you know, all sorts of different evidence. But we should try and gather that evidence honestly from reality and use that as a basis for our understanding of reality. And then we combine that with a process of reasoning. And there's lots of different ways of doing reasoning. We know our reasoning is always flawed. We're never going to be perfect, but at least we try and have a intellectually honest approach to thinking about the stuff we find out. So it suggests that sort of naturalistic evidence and reason answer to the question of what's real and how should we go about knowing things. That second important question, who gets to count, and ethics, is answered, and the clue is in the name, by the suggestion we should have moral consideration for sentient beings. The word sentientism is a little tricky to say, but if you break it up into sentient and just put ism on the end, it becomes a little bit more fluid. And that word sentient is the essence of, I guess, the scope of compassion sentientism suggests. And sentience, in its simplest definition, is really just the capacity to have experiences, or as examples to have the capacity to experience suffering or flourishing, which might be terms you could use for any sort of bad experience or any good experience. So sentientism suggests we should have compassion for all sentient beings, any being that can suffer or flourish, in simple terms. And that's basically it. So I've suggested on the right-hand side a way you might come into that way of thinking. And it starts out with the sense that each of us have, I hope, that we feel sentient. We're experiencing this conversation right now. Hopefully you're not suffering too much and you're flourishing at least a little bit in the conversation. But, we are having experiences. They can be positive, they can be negative, they can be neutral. That's one of the things that we're most confident of, is that we're experiencing. And as we look around ourselves, we can reason based on the evidence from reality that many other beings seem to be sentient too. I can look at the people on this call, I have a very high credence that you're probably sentient. And because I experience suffering as bad and flourishing as good, again, this seems really obvious and pretty basic. I want to live and I want to flourish, and I don't want to suffer and I don't want to die. This is pretty straightforward stuff. But again, it seems logically straightforward that, you all and other sentient beings probably feel in a similar way. Suffering almost tautologically, almost definitionally, is a bad thing. And if our morality is about, in any sense, having a concern for others, if our morality is about some sense of caring for others outside of ourselves, there's an implication for me that we need to be thinking about the perspective of those others when we're thinking about what right and wrong and good and bad are. And if you're thinking about the perspective of another, I guess you are talking about their own experiences and how they feel about those experiences. And morality, almost definitionally, in this way of thinking, is caring about the experiences of others. And if we're caring about the experiences of others, to my mind, it makes sense to care about all others who can have experiences. I can't see why there would be a reason we would care about some of the beings that have experiences, but not others. So, wouldn't it be consistent for us to have moral consideration for every being that can suffer or can flourish? So again, that's a sort of example personal journey that some people might go through to arrive at a sort of sentientist way of thinking. I'm happy to sort of take questions as I go through as well, but hopefully that lays it out fairly clearly. It might be useful to summarize very quickly on this page, I guess, its intellectual heritage and where these ideas of sentientism came from. And I'd summarize it really as two main threads. The central one that you can see is this naturalistic idea of using evidence and reason to try and understand the world, maybe set in contrast to sort of revelation or a fideism or maybe a supernatural worldview. So that naturalistic way of thinking has got very deep ancient roots all around the world in many cultures. That naturalistic way of thinking to some degree predates many of the modern religions, many modern schools of thought. It certainly predates the modern Enlightenment, goes back deep into human past. And you could, if you want to get really edgy, say, well, in a sense, it's even pre-human, because there's a degree to which even non-human animals that existed long before humanity came on the scene were using evidence from their senses of their environment to try and honestly develop beliefs and understandings and operate on that basis. So it may be pushing it a little bit too far to say non-human and pre-human animals were naturalistic before we came on the scene, but I quite like extending that intellectual heritage even pre-human if you want to go that far. The other critical chunk, which is more about the ethics on the left-hand side, is this concept that it's not just humans that matter morally, maybe non-human animals matter. And again, this is a line of thought that, of course, has lots of modern themes around veganism and animal ethics and animal rights that you can trace back through some of the names I've laid out there, through the 21st century, the 20th century. You can push that back into the 18th century to people like Jeremy Bentham, who asked that central question. The question is not, can they talk or can they reason, but can they suffer, which is another great way of thinking about sentience. But again, you can go much, much deeper than that. So when you go into, again, around the world, ancient cultures, religious and not, you'll find concepts like ahimsa, the idea of doing no harm, which from its very earliest roots wasn't just about doing no harm to humans. It was about doing no harm to any being that can be harmed, which is, again, another way of saying sentient. So both the naturalism idea, how do we understand reality, and this idea of an ethic that goes out to include all sentient beings have deep and ancient roots. And I guess what I'm suggesting here is that they come together in this idea of sentientism. I won't talk about the stuff on the right-hand side, but we can get into that in the Q&A if you like, because there's some slightly weird sci-fi stuff going on if people are interested in futurism and sci-fi ideas, but let's leave that for the Q&A. Again, I won't take you through all of these different dimensions, but it's interesting to, one of my hesitations about talking about sentientism is we already have too many isms. There are many of them. But I thought there was something distinctive about this idea that led me to sort of take the word that's been around since the 1970s and try and refresh it and modernize it and build a movement around it. But for the purposes of this conversation, it might be worth drawing at least maybe 3 of these examples out. So one is, some of you may be familiar with the movement and the idea of humanism, which in a sense sounds quite similar. It has a sort of evidence and reason naturalistic way of understanding the world, but you can tell the difference already in the name is that humanism, the center of gravity of it, is still about the human species. That's a little unfair because many humanists have a much broader range of compassion, but the movement itself, the center of gravity is still about humans. So sentientism clearly contrasts there and explicitly setting a moral scope based on sentience, not just on, I guess, a human species solidarity. To the bottom right, veganism, of course, a vibrant and rapidly growing movement, which has a lot in common with sentientism, because I think many vegans, certainly ethical vegans, their motivation really is driven by that concern for sentience, for wanting to try and avoid causing suffering or death, particularly where it's needless. So there's a strong overlap there, I guess, in terms of the way of thinking. But there are some differences. Sentientism is explicitly naturalistic, whereas many ethical vegans aren't. And there's also some wiggle room around the edges. And most definitions of veganism focus on the word animal, which is more of a taxonomic definition, whereas sentientism focuses on the characteristic of sentience. So what that does, in a sense, is focus on a characteristic rather than a group of beings. They overlap pretty strongly because current scientific evidence demonstrates that many animals we might think of are sentient, so there's an overlap there. But at the borders, there are some slight differences, with some of the very simplest animals. For example, like a sea sponge, it has no nervous system at all. So, you might argue that's an animal, but not a sentient being. So there are some slight differences, but there's overlap too. But the third difference and contrast I wanted to draw was on the top left with eco and biocentrism, which I think will be relevant to the work that Terra and these groups do, that I'll come on to in more detail now, because you might set sentientism on a spectrum, if you like, of thinking about who gets to count, this ethical question. And it might make sense for me to delve into a little bit more detail on the next page about that spectrum, because you can think of a spectrum going from anthropocentrism, which is focusing on humans and centering on humans, broadening out to sentiocentrism, which is focusing on sentience, broadening out even more to biocentrism, which is a moral consideration, if you like, for all living things, including those that aren't sentient, and going out even beyond that to something like ecocentrism or holism, which might care even about non-living entities in our environment as well. So they're almost, you can think of them as concentric circles going broader and broader. But what I thought might be useful to do on this page, and again, it's a bit detailed, but I'm very happy to send the slides around if people want to delve into it, is to zero in on who matters in these different ways of thinking, because I think that's one of the centrally important things for us to get right if we're trying to do good in the world, is who gets included, who gets to count, and who gets excluded. Because in simple terms, if you're excluded from moral consideration, you are rendered meaningless and valueless, and that means basically anything can be done to you with complete impunity. So to even have some basic chance of benefiting or from compassion or from care, you need to be included in our worldview. So what I've tried to do here is set out on the left-hand side a bunch of types of entities, things, if you like. And I've included a load of animals, human, charismatic wild animals, companion animals, farmed animals, other wild animals, non-sentient animals like the sea sponge I mentioned. I've included plants as the primary example of living entities that current science doesn't think are sentient. I've included environmental non-living stuff there as well. So rocks, rivers, mountains, species, diversity, concepts like that. And again, with the sci-fi hat on, artificial and alien intelligence at the bottom. So if you like, you've got a menu of entities and you can work out who gets to count. Then I've put in a, is it sentient question, which again, sentientism doesn't tell us the right answer. It just says take a naturalistic sort of scientific approach, be prudent and try and follow the evidence. But I think I've done a reasonable job of suggesting where current scientific consensus is that humans, many wild animals, companion animals, farmed animals, most other wild animals are sentient, and the other stuff isn't. And then let's run through, and you can see how all of these different worldviews that I've set out across the top might grant moral consideration, who gets to count, who gets a tick or a question mark or a cross. So I'd suggest the default human, and it's a bit hard to summarize given the diversity of our own species, will grant moral consideration to humans. Now some, and there are many problems with intrahuman ethics that we're still working through, will only grant moral consideration to subgroups, and we know what horrors that can lead to. But at least in concept, I think most humans recognize the validity of, for example, universal human rights. Every human, regardless of race, gender, sexuality, where they grew up, class, background, should get to matter. So they get a reasonably solid tick. Charismatic wild animals, I think people will feel that they matter, but it's a little bit of a question mark. It sort of depends which you are and in what context. People enjoy watching them on nature programs, but it's not clear whether they really have moral consideration for those charismatic wild animals. Companion animals, again, you generally get a pretty solid tick. Many of you will share your homes with a rabbit or a guinea pig or a cat or a dog or some form of companion. And I think they, by and large, do get moral consideration. We can think about scientific ways of assessing sentience, but you also just need to look into the eyes of a puppy and you'll get a pretty direct, intuitive answer that there is a being there can suffer and flourish too. So I think they get a pretty strong tick too, although the way some companion animals are treated leads me to put a bit of a question mark in. Then we get to a difficult point with the default human, because while we intuitively feel that compassion for a companion puppy at our feet, farmed animals in practical terms do not get moral consideration. Again, there might be a conceptual moral consideration there in extremis, but in the way most humans practically take decision in their lives, farmed animals don't get moral consideration. And I'd argue other wild animals don't either. If you're charismatic and you're on a nature program, you've got a bit of a chance, but given there are probably a quintillion or a sextillion of other wild animals out there, there's essentially zero moral consideration granted to them as well. So let's move across now into different ways of thinking. I'm going to skip the default humanist version and come to the sentientist view and show basically how that, I think, distinguishes itself from a default human starting point. Humans get a solid tick because humans are sentient, so they're in. Charismatic wild animals get a solid tick because, to the degree they're sentient, they're in. And again, it's mind-blowing to consider this category and the other wild category. The scale is absolutely mind-blowing. It's almost impossible to quantify, but the estimates are something like a sextillion sentient beings out there in the wild. I think it's a 1 with 21 zeros after it. So the scale is pretty mind-blowing. But if they're sentient, they get a tick. Companion animals, of course, they're sentient, they get a tick. Farmed animals, again, the animals we farm are by and large sentient, they get a tick, which leads you to the overlap with veganism I mentioned earlier on. And other wild animals, again, get a tick. So that's quite clear. Now, a strict sentientist gives a cross to plants and the environment and some of these other concepts, but a strict sentientist like myself would still richly care about plants, the environment, species, habitats, rocks, rivers, the ecosystems, the earth as Gaia, but we do that instrumentally, because those things are so important to the experiences of all the sentient beings that live on this planet and share and need that environment, which may seem a bit silly, but it's slightly different from intrinsically granting moral consideration. And the reason for that is quite simple, in that if we come back to the way I described that whole imperative to consider the perspective of the other, I guess the sentientist would say, a farmed animal or a wild animal that's sentient does have its own perspective. It can suffer, it can flourish, it can have interests and preferences and want its life to be a certain way. And our morality is concerned for that. Whereas they'd argue a rock or a river or a tree might be deeply important in instrumental ways because of the sentient beings that live on and around them, including humans, but they don't have their own perspective. They can't in themselves suffer or flourish. So in themselves, we don't need to give them compassion, but we can care about them in other ways, if that makes sense. So a couple of other examples as we go further towards the right. And I mentioned already this idea of biocentrism, caring about all living things, and ecocentrism, caring about, even more broadly than that, non-living elements of our environments too. Slightly cheekily, I've described a sort of consistent biocentrist or an ecocentrist, because what I suggest a biocentrist or an ecocentrist should do is tick all the same boxes as the sentients, because, for example, farmed animals are living beings, so they should count if you're a biocentrist, right? They should get direct moral consideration. They're also parts of our ecosystem, so they should count too. So a consistent biocentrist or a consistent ecocentrist should tick all the same boxes as the sentientist, but also add ticks for plants, non-sentient living things, and then by extension, species, mountains, rocks, rivers, ecosystems as well. Unfortunately, what I more often see is people who've taken a biocentrist or a ecocentrist stance in one sense. They say, look, I care about plants, rocks, rivers, trees, and ecosystems, but they're in a way dragged back to the human default when it comes back to thinking about other wild animals and particularly farmed animals. So unfortunately, the sort of default biocentrist or the default ecocentrist, while it seems quite generous in terms of expanding this scope of moral consideration really broadly out to non-living elements of the environment and non-sentient living things, sometimes unfortunately puts crosses in the boxes practically when it comes to farmed and other wild sentient animals. So hopefully that's given you, it's probably too much, but it's given you a sense of the practical implications of what our worldview might do for who gets to count in our moral system. And you can imagine the implications that might have for our own personal decisions, but also for policy, for institutional interventions, and so on. So there's another half of this presentation which I'm not going to go into, so don't worry when you look at the slide numbers. I want to stop on this page and then we can go into a conversation. But I wanted to draw out some implications of this way of thinking that hopefully will be relevant to the environmental and the climate imperatives that Tara and your teams are learning about and working on. So on the left-hand side, this naturalistic approach of evidence and reason, to my mind, suggests that we should think about reality in a way that is grounded in humility and doubt. And that rather than forming 100% binary beliefs about things that are true or not true, which humans love to do, we love binaries, we should instead think about credences. So they're like beliefs, but they're just more probabilistic. So the idea would be, rather than saying I'm 100% sure that, for example, Adam is sentient, I might have a very high degree of credence, a certain percentage probability that he is, based on the evidence that I've received so far from talking to him on Twitter and here. So our credences should be probabilistic, rather than 100% locked in one way or the other. Secondly, that they should be provisional, because part of the idea behind that probability is you'll shift it as new evidence comes in. If you learn something new, you find out something differently, your credences will shift and those probabilities will go up and down. So that's what I mean by provisional. And that's really where the humility comes from. There's always a chance we might be wrong. And that the third P, after probabilistic and provisional, is that we should be prudent where our decisions are going to have some sort of ethical impact on others. We should be careful, benefit of the doubt, move cautiously, and so on and so forth. So that's, I guess, one line of thinking that comes through this naturalistic way of thinking that I think is really important in how we work on environmental and climate issues too. And that's partly because if we're really trying to do that well and reason honestly, we've got to be very aware of our own limitations as, you know, evolved human apes when we're trying to think about evidence and reasoning, because our evidence is never going to be perfect. Our perceptions are always subject to illusions. You know, our science is a human enterprise that makes mistakes and has flaws. Our own reasoning has biases, you know, motivated reasoning. There's all sorts of different problems in our own reason that we need to be skeptical of and ready to address. And that can be really important in issues like climate change and the environment, because the ethical imperative seems so strong for us that sometimes that can lead us into motivated reasoning, maybe overstating cases or looking for certain types of evidence that support our conclusions. So I think there's some important lessons there about maintaining our own credibility through that humility and learning about and understanding. And the final point is really important, which I think helps us avoid those binaries and that overconfidence and maintain that humility. It's just to be comfortable saying, I don't know. You know, reality is super complex, so are our own minds. It's okay to say, I don't know, and keep trying to work out a better answer than it is to switch to a binary or follow some sort of polarized group-driven dynamic down a particular path. You know, saying I don't know is an intellectually healthy thing to do. On the right-hand side, there's a few implications there as well. So I do think this focus on sentience does draw us to remind ourselves about the individuals. So I think groups and concepts can be deeply important. So in this context, thinking about ecosystems, thinking about habitats, thinking about species, thinking about biodiversity are all richly important. But I would argue that ultimately, those are concepts that can't suffer in their own right. They are important because they're useful ways of describing large-scale complex impacts that ultimately impact the individuals. So I do, in my way of thinking about this, pull everything back to the suffering and flourishing of individuals. So I think that's an interesting lens to remind ourselves of. Sometimes we can get lost thinking about abstract concepts and groups and large macro concepts, and it's also always useful to draw us back to the individual. There's a central question there about, is an individual sentient or not? And again, I'm suggesting we should take a sort of naturalistic, scientific, prudent approach to trying to work that out, where we grant beings the benefit of the doubt. That might be something that comes up in the question. And this look through their eyes thing, I think it's absolutely central to morality. We're really used to doing this in human ethics. Right? One of the most essential things we do in human ethics is consider the perspective of the other, particularly if there's a victim of oppression, a victim of something bad that's being done. We will immediately, intuitively think, what would it feel like to be one of those people? And I guess all sentientism is suggesting is that's exactly the mindset we should try and adopt when we're thinking about other sentient beings too. It may feel a little bit harder with a non-human sentient being because they are of a different species. But I think for the most important needs and interests and wishes that we have as humans, those are the ones that are most richly shared across the rest of certainly the animal kingdom too. So while we might not know, exactly what it's like to be a bat, and a pig in a farm might not have exactly the same richness of career aspirations as someone on this call might have, when you get down to the real basics, the really fundamentally important stuff, even for us as humans, wanting to live, wanting to avoid suffering, wanting to avoid physical pain, wanting emotional reassurance, wanting a social network and a family, the most important things, sustenance, shelter, I think we can be pretty confident we can at least get a rough idea of what it might be like to be a non-human sentient too. And the final, two more things. One is, again, I think it's really important in the environmental and the climate space generally to make sure that our concern for nature and ecosystems doesn't turn into an unquestioning reverence. And there's a fallacy called the naturalistic fallacy, which can lead people to assume that because something is in nature, i.e., without human intervention or involvement, it is by definition a good thing. And I can understand that perspective because of the damage that humans often cause and the hubris we often have about the way we intervene. But we need to be a little bit careful that reverence doesn't hide a great deal of suffering. And I think we should just take a more balanced approach to thinking about nature and what it is. To my mind, nature is it's not good, it's not bad, it's amoral. I think it's just a process, and it has an enormous amount of wonder in it. It has a lot of aesthetic pleasure for us. It has a lot of flourishing sentient beings in it, but it also has a lot of suffering sentient beings in it as well. So I think we just need to watch for, that's one trap I sometimes see come through in environmental movements, is this a reverence for nature that leads us to ignore the interests of many of the sentient beings that might be out there in nature. And I'll finish on a really positive, hopeful point, which is I think there are so many difficult, complex problems in the world where interests conflict, where reality is deeply hard to understand, where we just don't know the way forward. But the more I think about issues, particularly in the climate environment spaces, it seems that there are some very glaringly obvious win-win-wins that can be very good for humans, can be very good for non-human sentience, and can be very good for the environment that we all share and live in too. And I think if we can zero in on those win-wins, one, I think their impact will be enormous, but two, politically, we're much more likely to be able to get traction because we don't have to fight quite so many fights. We can get lots of diverse groups with different perspectives, with different value systems to come together and to drive things forward that will help on a human, a non-human, sentient, and an environmental lens too. So let me stop there. And yeah, I'd love to go into a conversation about what you think of the idea and whether you think it's useful or not.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a great presentation. Joshua, you had a really good question you put in the chat. Do you mind asking that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Jamie. It's super interesting philosophy. Going back to the slide that you had where you had the different, the table, kind of talked a little bit about moral consideration, and I was wondering what the term means in terms of like how a behavior or action might change across these different groups. It was a bit vague, maybe. What is considering? Maybe you have a few examples.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of philosophical terminology about moral consideration or moral status or moral standing, and I'm only an amateur philosopher, so I'll probably get some of the terms wrong. But to my mind, moral consideration is the most basic level. It's the level at which, when someone's thinking about what to do, right, whether something is right or wrong or good or bad, you get to count in the calculus, in the workings out, if you like. So if I'm thinking about, I'm trying to think of an obvious example, but if I'm thinking of walking down a path, and if I put my foot in one place, there is an ant, and if I put my foot in another place, there is a pebble that will get broken in two, I basically don't have any moral consideration for the pebble because I don't think it's sentient and won't suffer, whereas I do have some moral consideration for the ant because I think there's a good chance it's sentient and will suffer and die if I tread on it. So it's like the most basic level for, as we're thinking through ethical decisions, who do we consider in that? Now, you might then ask the question, well, could you have such a level of consideration that is so low that it's not really meaningful? And I would suggest not really. I think even a basic level of moral consideration would imply that you would see needlessly causing that being to suffer or die as a significant negative. So does that make sense? So I use that as a way of practically saying who gets moral consideration. It basically means I would see needlessly harming or killing you as a bad thing to do, as a significantly bad thing to do. Does that answer the question? You broke up a little bit, but hopefully that.
Yeah, I think my headphones aren't great. It does make sense if I think about it in terms of what a vegan believes and who they consider. Like a vegan is like extremely strict, and they would never eat any animal products, I would guess, because it would assume there was some sort of suffering as a result. But maybe they would consider, okay, if it's an animal that I look after and it's a chicken that produces eggs and there is no suffering and there's some sort of reciprocal relationship there, then that might be okay for a vegan, for example.
Yeah, and it varies because the core definition of veganism is really about doing what we can to avoid the exploitation of animals, but also causing their suffering or death. So some vegans will focus on exploitation almost regardless of the suffering. So they'll say, even if you can find some form of exploitation which doesn't cause suffering, I still don't want to do that. Others will focus more explicitly on the suffering and death. And I think there is a difference between I guess the movement, and I count myself as a vegan as well, is more about, in a way, boycotting products, services, and decisions I can take that might cause exploitation, suffering, or death, which is not quite as broad as a moral consideration for all sentient beings. So one interesting, challenging conversation I often have with fellow vegans is there is a sense that with a vegan mindset, if I can avoid causing suffering, my job is done. But a sentientist worldview says, well, actually, there are the sextillion animals in the wild that are also suffering. You know, that matters. You know, maybe there could be an imperative for us to do something to help them. So yeah, there is an overlap. I think most people who adopt a sentientist way of thinking would be led to veganism or something very close to it, because farming essentially is needlessly harming and killing sentient beings largely for our pleasure and social norm compliance. But at the same time, there are some differences in the breadth of the philosophy, if you like.
It reminds me of a couple of different things. Like one would be, say, KFC introducing plant-based chicken nuggets into their menu, and someone who just says, I want to avoid causing suffering, might be able to somehow modify that buying plant-based chicken nugget from KFC is like still morally okay. There might be some say like the overall entity that is producing this food is also causing the harm, and so by sort of relationship is like sort of moral and justified. That's where it starts to get maybe a bit vague. The other thought I had was around the kind of anti-racist movement.
Yeah,
it's not enough just to be not racist, but you need to actively fight against racism. And I wonder if that's sort of, you've thought about this in the like sentientism, whether you have to actively sort of avoid or take down any sort of harm against any sentient beings.
That's an important question, because one of the other challenges that sometimes comes through with veganism, and this is a fiery debate within vegan groups or at the moment, is should veganism focus on the non-human animals, given the harm we cause, or by extension, should veganism also focus on human ethics too, because humans are also animals, right? So if there's exploitation of other humans, surely that's bad too. And I'm firmly in favor of the latter. I think a consistent veganism has to think, well, humans are animals too, so we should be concerned about all of those intra-human discriminations and oppression and exploitation and suffering too. But to answer your question, and this might be a bit irritating, but it is deliberate, is that sentientism is very neutral on many, many complex, difficult, important topics deliberately. So it simply says we should take a naturalistic approach to understanding reality. And it simply says every sentient being warrants moral consideration, but that's all it says. So it doesn't say, should you take a utilitarian approach or a deontological approach or a feminist care ethic approach or a relational approach. And it's also irritatingly neutral on the point you just flagged, which is almost like a sort of, how demanding is this? You know, so all sentient beings matter, but what are we then obliged to do? And it doesn't answer that question. And the reason it doesn't answer that question, one, is because it's difficult. But two, because I think it's most important to lock in that platform of at least acknowledging the moral consideration for all the sentient beings first. And then we can work out what the implications are for the level of demand. But I think for most people that take this sort of stance, they do not stop at just, you know, I'm not going to cause harm myself. They do see that there is a moral imperative in other suffering too, and wanting to try and find ways to mitigate that. I think that obligation does naturally flow from a moral consideration. That's certainly my personal stance. I don't think it's enough to just step away from the harm you cause yourself. I do think there is an obligation to do more. And in that context, being against all forms of oppression, racism included, I think is an imperative that flows.
I just want to say you had up the modified universal Declaration of Human Rights, modifying that to the sentientism is kind of a good analogy. Also, like in the class, I know we've talked about you put a cost on things in the environment versus there's now some movements have a rights-based view of these things. I think that's where sentientism kind of flows into that thinking, is that these sentient creatures aren't simply something that can be owned as part of a property, things like that. They have some kind of basic rights just by the fact that they are sentient. And just like with a person, we have moral consideration for interpersonal relations. Any kind of sentient creature warrants that sort of consideration as well. Like Jamie was saying, I think it's like it's more a set of questions to ask when you go into kind of some kind of dilemma than a fixed set of beliefs. It's not like a dogma. It's more just kind of a shared basis, like he was saying, and going forward from there, what kind of questions we ask, what kind of actions we want to take, like that. Andy, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Super interesting. The one that stood out to me that I was just curious on, it might be a slight diversion to the topics we talked about, the AI part of it. I thought that was really fascinating that AI was included in it and actually sort of merged with alien intelligence, which seems like a little bit interesting. So yeah, I'm just curious to know why AI counts, and maybe the provocation is, why does AI count whereas plant life doesn't count, for example?
Yeah. Well, so most scientists and the people involved in the sort of groups and communities that have been building up around this get really annoyed when I talk about artificial intelligence and aliens, because their response, and I think quite rightly, is, look, there are 7.8 billion human sentients and maybe 100 billion sentient land animals and maybe 1 to 2 trillion sentient farmed fish and 6 trillion sentient wild animals out there. Why are you worried about entities that don't seem to exist at the moment? And I think that's an entirely fair pushback when it comes to priority. But at the same time, I quite like the fact that the idea is there, because one of the deliberate intents behind sentience is that instead of saying, look, there's this group of entities that count or that group of entities that count, what matters really is the characteristic, the capacity to have experiences, the capacity to suffer, for example. That's what matters. So just logically, whether or not it's relevant, that does imply that if some non-biological or even non-earth-based entity demonstrates that it is likely to have the capacity to suffer, then why wouldn't we care about that suffering in the same way? Now, my personal view is that current AI is not sentient at the moment, and I don't think we've encountered any aliens yet. They might be out there, but I'm not sure they've visited us yet. Other sentientists might have disagreements on both of those topics. So in a sense, there may seem as a bit of a sort of intellectual philosophical distraction, but I quite like the idea that we're focusing on the characteristic, because it makes it less likely we're going to get stuck by having picked just yet another arbitrary group that turns out to be wrong. I quite like the idea of focusing on the characteristic. But there's some, you touched on the plants, because I think that's another interesting area where sentientism itself is really irritatingly neutral, because it doesn't say, here's the list of beings that are sentient. I know I put one in the slide earlier, but that was just my interpretation of current scientific consensus. It doesn't say, here's the list. But what it does say is, when you're trying to work out which beings are sentient, which is obviously really important, because if you're included, you get some compassion. If you don't, you could be destroyed without a moment's hesitation. So that's important. When you're working that out, follow a naturalistic approach, try and follow the science, be prudent, and use that approach. So there are some people who talk about the potential for plant sentience, and in simple terms, sentientism would say, well, if there's decent evidence that plants are sentient, then they should count morally too. Now, my personal view of the current scientific consensus is that plants are demonstrating amazing capabilities, the ability to communicate through fungal networks, behaviors that look very different when you speed up the time-lapse camera and so on. But given their information processing architecture, I've not come across any evidence that they demonstrate the same sorts of capabilities that we think of as sentient. So I don't think plants are sentient at all. But again, that's another thing that sentientism is neutral on. If we find the evidence that they are, then we should care about them. The same with the AI and the aliens. But one thing I would say is if aliens come to visit and they're more powerful than us, then we'd better hope they're sentientists, because we might be in trouble. And if they look at what we've done with animal farming and take that as an example of how to treat less powerful sentients, we're in real trouble. Whereas when they arrive, I can just point at the podcast and said, I granted you rights and moral consideration even before you arrived. So at least put me in the free range version of your farm. Sorry, that was a long answer, Andy, but good question. I saw another question earlier on about Buddhism. Did I see that? Oh yeah, from Ajit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think it does have some. Yeah, I could well be an alien. Maybe I've disguised myself well enough. I'm taking notes on the conversation. I think it does have some connections with Buddhism. Partly because some people will disagree about whether Buddhism is a religion or not. But Buddhism, in a sense, is much more naturalistic than most of the other religious movements, and it doesn't have a sort of deity, and it tends to take a more, I guess, naturalistically grounded way of understanding the world. But there's another commonality in this idea of ahimsa and moral consideration for non-humans as well, I think, is a thread that runs through it. Yeah, I think there are certainly some links there, and that goes back to the earlier slide I mentioned. These central ideas of a naturalistic way of understanding the world and caring about non-humans that can suffer as well have got deep ancient roots, and many of them flow through Buddhism.
I have a question. It's like you said before, probably not something that gets answered, but competing interests. What kind of questions would a sentientist ask when there's kind of competing interests, competing moral considerations, where there's something like, for example, testing for medication for the future, or some kind of land use thing where there's an existing animal or some kind of sentient population there, but it could benefit others. What's the process for handling that?
So the thing that sentientism helps with is simply who gets to be included in that conversation and who gets to count as we're working it through. But I'm going to annoy you because it is another thing that it's neutral on in terms of working out how to handle competing interests. It just says all of those sentient beings, their interests should be taken into account, but it doesn't tell us the answer. So for those of you who are familiar with moral philosophy, there's a load of different schools of thought within moral philosophy about how to handle competing interests and trade-offs, for example. So utilitarians will think about utility as often reflecting the well-being, the suffering, the flourishing of individual sentient beings, but they might take what sometimes feels a more mathematical approach to averaging out or totaling up or aggregating utility and thinking in those terms. So there's a caricature thought experiment that can make some utilitarians squirm, where if you have 5 people who are very ill and are going to die unless they get an organ transplant, and you have one very healthy person who has all of those organs, would it be ethical to kill the one healthy person to save the 5 other lives? So that's a caricature of a utilitarian approach, and most utilitarians would have a much richer answer that would still say that's a bad thing to do. But that gives an indication of utilitarian ways of sort of adding up things. There's another school of thought around deontology, which is more around following rules and compliance with those rules, but also in that sense, you might have heard of a philosopher called Kant, who talked about rational beings being ends in themselves, and that it's wrong to use for example, another human as an end, as a means to an end. They need to count in their own right, and that leads into rights thinking, which often says, look, this entity, often a human, has a right that's supposed to be a sort of incontrovertible, unbreakable thing. So that's another school of thought. There's a feminist care ethic, which more thinks about entities that warrant care and how we should express care. There are relational schools of thought that think about the nature of relations between ourselves as communities. There are contractual schools of thought that talk about reciprocity and so on. So all I'm saying is there's a whole world of moral philosophy out there that sentientism sort of stands back from and says, whatever your moral philosophical system is and however you want to go about resolving those interests, the platform has to be that every sentient being counts as you're working that through. And I think that's the most important thing to get right first. So that's going to be irritatingly neutral on failing to answer your question, Adam.
Joshua, it looks like you had another question there.
Yeah, I can ask. I don't want to take up too much space if other people have questions though. So please go ahead. Yeah, I was overall interested in, like, obviously you've had this long career in consulting and then you suddenly became a sentientist and gave it all up and it's like pursuing this path. I'm curious, what is your sort of goal? Like, why did you get into it? What was your intention? But like, yeah, if more people, and particularly those people who maybe have power and influence, became sentientists, what do you think would happen in the world?
Yeah, that's a big question. So so the simple, thanks Ajit, thanks for joining. The simple answer is the plan is to persuade all 7.8 billion humans to commit to using evidence, reason, and compassion in all things, thereby solving all the world's problems. So that's the plan. But in simple terms, and there is a section of the website which we've built out called How, and it's difficult because, you know, sentientism is very neutral. It's just a very pluralistic platform. But I think there are some policy implications you could run through, and the sorts of things I think you'd see happening. One is, you know, an end to intrahuman discrimination and exploitation. I think you'd see a much more rational approach to policy and politics that had humility but was grounded in evidence rather than a sort of polarized identitarian approach, maybe. You would see, in short, a just transition to completely end all animal farming and ideally all animal exploitation, which might seem a radical policy implication now, but I think it's one that would, again, be a clear win-win-win for the environment, for humans and for non-human animals. And I think you would also see a different approach to environmental and climate challenges. It would be rational, it would be grounded in evidence, and I think it would actually be powered up because it would be driven by a compassion for, you know, a sextillion sentient beings in the wild and humans, not just by a sort of softer generic concern for the environment because we as humans need it. But I think the nature of the interventions we drive in trying to improve the environment and maintain our climate would also be infused by that compassion. So there are some things we do in the interests of a better environment that actually cause much harm to many sentient beings. And I think we would look at those and go, hold on, let's take a step back, let's take a different approach. So one just example I'll call out is there's a strong theme within the modern environmental movement, for example, that is trying to adapt animal agriculture and think about, are there regenerative ways of doing animal agriculture? One, I think the evidence doesn't support that they're good for the environment anyway, because animal agriculture in any form is shockingly wasteful given the inefficiency of feeding plants through animals and then killing them. But a sentientist stance would also look at that and go, okay, well, it's maybe less environmentally harmful, and maybe it's slightly less unethical. But when we take the perspective of the victims, it puts those initiatives in a very stark light, given we already have a much better answer, which is frankly eating plants and freeing up 3/4 of global agricultural land. So I think it would add energy to the environmental movement, but it would also add compassion that I think would direct and redirect some of the initiatives that we're pushing through the environmental movement as well. So that's, yeah, again, a long answer, but yeah. And it's an odd thing to do in a way, because I'm often in two minds, because there are so many more specific things we can do that are directly impactful. And working on improving humanity's worldview seems a bit philosophical and a bit background and a bit generic. But at the same time, every individual that adopts a naturalistic worldview and one that has sentient-centric compassion, every decision they take from then on, both as an individual and through their role influencing institutions and driving and leading institutions, I think every single decision has a slightly better chance of being right. So in a way, it's, I'm hoping it's maybe a sort of background, but quite deep intervention that would ultimately help humanity move forward in a better, more compassionate way. But maybe I'm breathtakingly naive. So
one quick question to jump off the talking about climate change is carbon, like we know, stays in the atmosphere for a long time, and it's going to affect sentient beings in the future. How in the slides you've mentioned the second to nth degree of effects. How do you how are future unborn, I guess, sentient beings factored in? If you doing something now might be beneficial right now, but in the future it's going to doom, an entire generation or an entire species. How does that play in?
Yeah, that's another fascinating area of philosophy, and it's difficult as well because there are questions about, should future generations matter of human and non-human animals, but also how much should they matter? And there's a whole field called population ethics that you can start out with some quite common sense views and can lead you to some really difficult ethical places, because the scale of potential future sentient beings is even more mind-blowing than the numbers that exist today. So it's a really complex topic. And again, sentientism doesn't sort of tell us a specific answer on that. It just says that sentient beings matter. Arguably even future sentient beings should matter too. So my personal view on that, again, from an amateur perspective, is I do think we should take future generations of human and non-human into account, and I don't think we should discount the importance of them purely based on how far away they are in the future. I think arguably you could say, why should an animal that will live in 100 or 1,000 years matter any less than one that exists today? But I do think it makes sense to discount it based on the likelihood of them existing. And I guess my other cop-out stance is that I think the best chance we have of making a better world and a better universe for future sentient beings is to make the world better for the sentient beings that are here right now. So in a sense, even though I do have a rich concern for future generations, I still bring that back to the billions of sentient beings that are on the planet today, because I think if we get things wrong now, that can be extremely bad for future generations. And if we get things right now, that can be extremely good for them. So I still come back to quite a sort of presentist stance, even though I do care about future generations too. And partly, I think, when we look through things in the rest of the slide pack here about, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think one of the things those are already trying to do is suggest that, imagine the emotional and intellectual capacity of 7.8 billion humans that we could free up to do good in the world if we can free people from poverty and oppression and so on. And I think that point plays through even as you update these to say, let's recast the SDGs to think about all sentient beings, or let's rewrite the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for all sentient beings. I think if we can help the sentient beings that exist today, that's the best chance of making a better future for future generations too.
Thank you. Jamie, do you have another couple minutes? I see Francois.
Yeah, I'm fine for time. I know we've hit the hour, so if people need to run, go for it, but I can run over happily.
Fantastic. Francois, do you want to ask?
Sure. Thanks for your time, Jamie. So I'm vegan and I run a vegan investment club in Canada. And I am curious to know what you, like, if you are involved in any political party or if you're pushing towards, pushing policies as part of your involvement. Because I think, I see obviously the wide benefits of sentientism, but I'm curious to see how it materialized in terms of the economical, political sphere.
Yeah, so one of the I've just included a link to the YouTube channel there as well. I've been lucky to interview just over 100 amazing people so far. But the thing I was going to post in was actually a page about politics and the implications for politics. So let me just post that in. because I do think that this way of thinking, this worldview, is because it's so broad, it influences almost every human decision, and that includes politics. So some of the implications, I think, on politics would include recasting our politics. So when we're thinking about policies and what makes a policy good or bad, we would no longer just think about their impact on humans. We wouldn't just think about the impact on the environment. We would think about the impact on sentient beings as well, and find some way of representing sentient beings even in our own democracies. And some people would laugh at that and say, well, you can't have a chicken and a pig and a dolphin in our parliament or voting, for example. And I think that's fair. But we already have examples where within our current systems, we represent those who aren't able or don't have the capacity to represent themselves in our democratic institution. We don't ignore children because they can't vote or attend parliament. And we already, I think in Wales and New Zealand, a couple of other places, there are already ministers for future generations who are there to represent the interests of future generations who haven't yet been born. So I think we could use those similar sort of approaches to represent all sentient beings, even within our politics too. And to your point, I do support a range of different political parties around the world that you can see moving in this direction. So most of them so far are framed as animal parties, for example. So you'll see that in Austria and Australia and in a few other places in the US as well. So they're pushing a more non-human animal agenda. But others are taking a broader agenda that are, again, trying to find different ways of including consideration for sentient beings in our politics too. And I think to your point about the investment club, you can see that playing through some of the corporate world as well. So whether it's transition paths for helping animal farmers move to something that's more ethical and less environmentally destructive, you can see it, of course, in the cultivated and clean meat, the alternative products to help make it easy for consumers to do the right thing and switch away from animal product. So I think you can see it flowing through the political world and the corporate world too. And the quicker it does, the better, in my perspective. And that's another thing that, again, sentientism is really irritating and neutral on, but it's been fascinating for me as we've built this community, is the sheer diversity of economic and political views you'll find amongst sentientists. So they all say, look, we take a naturalistic approach to understanding reality. They all say we care about all sentient beings, but that could lead you into lots of different directions depending on how you think economics works, what you think the best political system is. So there are sentientists, anarchists and socialists and centrists and people who have fairly right-wing politics, and they just have very different views about the best way of doing the best thing for all sentient beings. But hopefully that answers your question, Francois.
Absolutely, very, very interesting. Your last point, I totally agree. I have friends across all the spectrum, from like super ultra capitalist to like anarchist. So I can definitely, and we have part of those people as well in our club. So yeah, thanks for your answer.
The other thing I'd say on the politics is that, and you can see it, here in this, on the slide that's sitting behind this, is it's actually not that hard to do, because I think you can take a lot of the positive things we've tried to do haltingly as a human species, and the SDGs are one example, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is another, and it's actually remarkably easy to rework those just thinking about all sentient beings. Again, because of the thing I said before, you can look here on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I've had a go at drafting Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights. There are some where you look at it and go, that just doesn't make sense, right? What does the right to an education mean for certain non-human animals? On the one hand, you could say, well, actually, parents do still educate their children, even in non-human species as well. But you might be right. We're not saying pigs should be able to go to university. So there are certain rights here which may not make sense in the same context. But actually, the most important ones, the most fundamental ones, carry across quite easily. So I think there's some quite obvious and quite easy wins for us to take the institutions, the policies, the thinking, the rights declarations, the SDGs that we've already developed, always imperfectly, from a purely human perspective, and rework them for all sentient beings. And I think doing that would actually be better for humans too. And I'd argue we've seen that within the development of human rights as well. It's not a win-lose trade-off as we grant suffrage or we grant rights to broader groups of humans. That's benefited the privileged humans doing the granting as well. It wasn't like you had to give something up to be more generous in human rights. The more generous you are with the human rights, the better it is for the privileged humans that had the luxury of thinking these things through in the first place. And I think the same could be true across, if you like, sentientity. It can be a win-win.
Joshua, it looks like you have another question there.
We could go forever. I think, so, I mean, I just thought back to your initial points right at the start of the presentation, where you were talking about sort of causes for, I think, problems in the world, coming down to like compassion and beliefs. And curious on your take on how like ignorance or awareness, because it came up to me like when you're thinking about future sentient beings, where like maybe things that we do now, like we're unaware of the impacts that they have, because in the end it's like a prediction, and that even that might play a role in the present of like maybe things we're buying has some knock-on effect in a supply chain somewhere which we're sort of unaware of. So I'm curious about how that plays a role in sentientism, if you have something to say. It's not a very specific question, but
no, I think it's deeply important, because, and I think it does play into this epistemology, this reason and evidence question. One thing I would say is taking this naturalistic approach of using reason and evidence does not guarantee we will be right about everything by any means. It almost guarantees that we will always still be wrong in some sense, and that's the humility I was talking about before. We should always be open to new evidence and always have some doubt, always be skeptical of our own evidence and our own reasoning. So it's not about it's perfect. It's just that I don't see a better alternative to understanding the world by engaging honestly with it, and that's really what evidence and reason is, but it doesn't imply a perfect solution. But there are a bunch of different ways it can go wrong. So one obvious way is just believing fabrications that you've made up or that someone else has made up, right? That's one obvious way. You might get really lucky and the fabrication you made up happens to be correct, but it's breathtakingly unlikely. So fabrications is one thing. Another one is the biases we were talking about before, where you have motivated reasoning, where you've started with a conclusion which leads you to only look at certain evidence that supports you, but you conveniently ignore the evidence that goes against your conclusion, and that can lead you down a path. So that's another failure of reason and evidence, if you like, of epistemology. But I think you also mentioned, ignorance or unawareness are also problems, because if you just don't have the evidence to hand, or it's just unavailable to you, that is likely to lead you to having credences that are more likely to be wrong. So I agree. It's not just about do we believe fabrications or do we use evidence and reason? It's also about ignorance, awareness, cognitive biases, failures of reasoning. There are all sorts of different ways that those problems can be caused. And it's interesting because many people particularly who are already involved in the sort of animal advocacy worlds and the vegan worlds will sometimes say to me, look, why does sentientism include the naturalism stuff? Isn't it just enough to have this sentiocentric compassion for all sentient beings? Surely that's the core problem. But unfortunately, and we see this in human ethics too, even well-meaning, otherwise ethical people can do terrible things if they believe in things that just aren't true. And I don't want to get too political, but you can see what's going on in the Ukraine at the moment, for example. Of course, there's a failure of compassion there. There's an exclusion, and there's some directly sickeningly awful ethics. But there's also the explicit use of fabrications, lies, deliberately broken epistemology to justify awful actions. So again, that's why I come back to this fact. I do think we need both. Sentiocentric compassion is great. Naturalistic understanding is important, but neither by themselves is good enough, because you can have a completely naturalistic, accurate view of the world, but if you don't care, you can do bad things. But you can also have a quite compassionate, rich view of the world, but if you believe things that fundamentally are false or untrue, that can also lead you to terrible places. So that's partly why I think we need these two components in any worldview.
Yeah,
sorry, I'm rambling again.
It makes a lot of sense, I think, because I think the ignorance thing is just sort of in some ways it's true, and there's that's why journalists exist, to try and expose like bad things that happen, or some journalists exist to expose things that we didn't know before, expose human rights issues that maybe we didn't know, that then once they become into our sort of world, we become enraged or whatever, like, and that's fair, but there's also plenty of things that we are aware of, and I think create some sort of psychological distance from it to sort of justify the things. Like maybe we all use, as Adam said, like certain medical products or things like this that have included animal testing at some point, but yet we sort of justify it because we're all playing these sort of mind games to say like what is the right level. But I think the idea of veganism or sentientism is it kind of gives you this universal truth that like you have a stake in the ground. There might be times that you go wrong in it, and you might do things that sort of go against the overall value, but like once you have this at the core, it does make decision making a bit easier in some way. It does in some way make it binary, and then you're actively choosing, okay, like I know this is kind of against the rules of sentientism, but this is the kind of practical answer we have to give in this situation.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it's at least a solid starting point. It doesn't answer all the questions, it doesn't resolve all the conflicts, but it's a solid starting point. And the other thing your question made me think of is two of the other deep problems which I think affect, you know, that accurate understanding of the world and failures of compassion really are around human psychology and social norms. And there's a sense to which this is oversimplistic. I don't want to sort of reify what we're like as, you know, very young children, but when we're born and when we're growing up as, you know, young kids and toddlers, I think we do have a sort of naturalistic understanding of the world. We're like little scientists in a way. We're moving around, trying to understand things, using our senses, trying to learn, and, you know, working from there. And over time, family, friends, school, society does to some degree just teach us stuff that is wrong. And teaches us mistakes, and also teaches us ways of believing that aren't grounded in evidence. You know, you're just told, here's the truth just because, right? Just because an authority figure tells you the answer. So on the one hand, we start out as little naturalists maybe, and then society takes us away from that. I don't want to be oversimplistic, but I think a similar thing happens in the sentiocentric compassion, because if you put, you know, of course there are young kids that will, out of curiosity, you know, hurt animals just because they're sort of experimenting. But I think most young children, if you put them in a room with a pot-bellied pig and say, look, that would taste nice if you killed it, it wouldn't kill it, right? There is this sense of, I don't want to hurt other beings, right? I don't want to hurt other animals. But society, as with its powerful forces, and it did this to me, rapidly takes you to a place where you just come to accept that it's normal, maybe even, you know, desirable to at industrial scale needlessly harm and kill other sentient beings because they taste good, right? And the contrast between the perspective of the victim and our social norms is so stark there. It's amazing the power of those social norms. So there is something in I worry sometimes I'm sort of presenting this analytical view where, you know, if we have a sentiocentric compassion, we follow evidence and reason, you know, the answers will play out. But actually, I think the deep heart of most of our problems are really about social norms and human psychology. And those are the things we've got to look at with a very clear eye to really get to a decent epistemology and to a decent ethics. Because often, I think the same is true in the, you know, environment and climate spaces. Often we actually have most of the technical solution ready, and, you know, we know what we need to do. The problem is getting those damn humans to break the social norms and to break our own cognitive biases to just bloody do it. And whether that's political or individual or institutional, social. The more I think about these problems, the social norms and the human psychology are the blockers. Yeah, I mean, I'm very happy to take more questions, but the other thing I'd say is, you know, I'd love to continue the conversation. So, you know, you can reach out to me. I'm at Jamie Woodhouse on Twitter or at Sentientism. We have all of these different groups I've listed out there. You're welcome to join any or all of them. And they're open to anyone interested. They're not just, you know, for sentientists. It's not some sort of closed group. Anyone who's interested in these ideas is welcome to come along. So I'd love to continue the conversation. And yeah, it's all a bit amateurish. I don't really know where it's going or what's happening. It's very organic, but there are people from over 100 countries involved in these different communities now. And not many of them are working explicitly on, sort of promoting or pushing sentientism out there, but in a way they've almost sort of adopted it as a worldview. Some of them had it already, but now they've got a word for it. But most of them are working on more explicit and direct campaigns, as well as sort of pocketing this as as you said, the sort of baseline platform for the way they think too. But yeah, I'd love to continue the conversation and hear any feedback.
Fantastic, thank you. Are these slides available on the website? Someone was
So I've included screenshots of some of the slides here on the website, but I haven't put the whole pack up there. So what it might be easiest to do is I'm happy to send this pack to you, Adam, and if you can circulate it around, that would be absolutely fine. Just send the PDF around. I'm very happy to do that. Because the other things I've got in here, as I've had up in the background, is there's some stuff about the sort of academic history of the term and where it came from and what I'm trying to do with it now. There's some implications for activism. There's all the links to my writing, the website, and so on. We've got this quite cool "I'm a Sentientist" wall where people are signing up and helping to normalize their idea by saying, yes, I'm a Sentientist and this is why. We've got a suspected celebrities one as well, which has some interesting names of people who I think already think this way, even though they might not have heard of Sentientism yet. Which I've included some names on there. But yeah, I'm happy to send the PDF around. And you can see the work on the Sentientist development goals and the Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights as well.
fantastic, great. That'd be great. And I'll share also in Slack. We have a Slack channel. I'll share some of these links as well. Well, thank you very much. You've been very generous with your time. I think this was a great discussion. And like you said, it's an active community, so we can continue the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Please do. Thank you so much for your attention. It's been an honor to speak to you all.
Thank you so much.
Jamie.
Thank you.